So my talk today came out of some of my previous work on social kind essentialism. So I've argued that given a neo-Aristotelian concept of essence, social kind essentialism is a viable doctrine, and also it's a doctrine that provides a helpful framework for a lot of projects in social metaphysics. Now, one objection that I got repeatedly to that work is that, well, even if the concept of essence is helpful to descriptive projects in social metaphysics, it's actually unhelpful to and maybe even hostile to projects in ameliorative metaphysics. So for instance, Sally Haslinger's project. And so what I want to try to do in my talk today is to convince you that actually the concept of essence can even help us with ameliorative projects in social metaphysics. Specifically, it can help us to make sense of these sorts of projects. So I have three main aims in my talk. So the first will be to formulate a puzzle about what I'm calling ameliorative metaphysics. The second will be to articulate and then argue against several existing resolutions to this puzzle. And then the third, finally, will be to put forward my positive proposal, which I think offers a nice new resolution of the puzzle. And this will draw on a neo-Aristotelian concept of essence. Okay, so on to section one. So on the one hand, ameliorative projects, I think, are properly construed as pragmatic. So this is very clear from Sally Haslinger's original characterization of ameliorative projects. So she distinguishes ameliorative projects from both conceptual and descriptive projects. And she says that in an ameliorative project, we try to identify the legitimate purposes that our concept of some phenomenon X does or should serve. And then the aim is to define the concept of X so as to best serve these purposes. And this sort of project is pragmatic insofar as both our theoretical and practical purposes are directly relevant to theory choice, namely the choice of how to define X. So this pragmatic dimension of ameliorative projects, I think, is nicely illustrated if we look at actual examples of these projects in the literature. So Sally Haslinger gives an ameliorative analysis of gender in her 2000 paper. So she says that the purpose of gender concepts, such as woman and man, are to be effective tools in the fight against gender-based injustice within the context of feminist social theory. And then she goes on to propose her well-known analysis of being a woman in terms of being systematically subordinated on the basis of presumed female sex. So another nice example is Kate Mann's work on misogyny. So Mann suggests that the purpose of concepts, including misogyny and misogynist, is to be effective tools in the fight against gender-based injustice within everyday contexts. And then she goes on to propose an analysis where we understand misogyny as the hostile social forces which are faced by girls and women because they're girls and women, and which serve to police and enforce a patriarchal order. Final example is Robin Dembroff's work on sexual orientation. So they suggest that the purpose of the concept of sexual orientation is to, on the one hand, clarify the criteria for ascribing sexual orientation, and on the other hand, to be an effective tool in the fight against injustice faced by persons with queer sexual orientations within both everyday and legal contexts. And then they propose an analysis of sexual orientation in terms of dispositions to sexually engage with persons of certain sexes and genders. Okay, so we've seen then that ameliorative projects have this pragmatic element to them. At the same time, I think that ameliorative projects are properly construed as metaphysical projects. So many ameliorative theorists explicitly construe their projects in these metaphysical terms. So a nice example is Haslinger herself, who in a 2014 paper writes, quote, "I maintain that my analysis of gender is descriptive, in fact, descriptive of the material reality of gender, even if it is not descriptive of anyone's thinking about gender. In short, I am offering a theory of what gender is, not what some people think it is or what they think it should be. This is the goal of real definition." So in this quote, Haslinger explicitly states that her analysis of gender is descriptive. And then she furthermore suggests that her analysis provides a real definition of gender, where I take it that a real definition of X is a metaphysical account of what X is. So it's an account of the very nature or identity of X. Demroff is another person in the literature who construes their projects explicitly in metaphysical terms. So they write, quote, "Sexual orientation has yet to receive due in-depth metaphysical exploration. This paper lays the groundwork for one such in-depth exploration." Furthermore, their analysis of of sexual orientation is explicitly formulated in terms of the notion of metaphysical grounding, which is a distinctively metaphysical notion. So in addition to these explicit remarks by ameliorative theorists, I think that there's also an implicit consensus among these theorists that some analyses of social phenomena are just plain wrong in that they misrepresent social reality. So they describe social reality falsely or incorrectly. So for example, I think that there's a consensus that biological essentialism about gender is descriptively wrong. So it's descriptively inadequate. But if ameliorative projects were purely pragmatic, then ameliorative theorists would have no basis for saying that a given account is descriptively wrong. So I think the most they could say is that that account either misidentifies our legitimate purposes or fails to best serve those purposes. Okay, so then I've tried to argue that properly construed ameliorative projects have both this pragmatic dimension to them and this metaphysical dimension. So given this, I think we can formulate a puzzle about ameliorative metaphysics. And I've formulated it here as an inconsistent triad. And so this is on your handout. So the first premise is that normative and political considerations are relevant to theory choice in an ameliorative project. And so this draws on the pragmatic element of these projects. Second premise is that an ameliorative project is a descriptive metaphysical project, which aims to elucidate the real true nature of a given phenomenon. This draws on the metaphysical element. And third premise is that metaphysics is a value-neutral endeavor in which normative and political considerations are not relevant to theory choice. And so I want to suggest that these three premises are independently plausible, and yet they're jointly inconsistent because 2 and 3 are inconsistent with 1. Okay, so what's the support then for these premises? So the support for premise 1 comes from, again, the pragmatic dimension. So normative and political considerations are relevant to identifying the purposes that our concept of X should serve. It also might be relevant to identifying whether the existing purposes are legitimate. And the purposes we identify then bear on the choice of how to define X, because we're supposed to define X in a way that best serves the purposes. Okay, what about premise 2? So this is supported by this metaphysical dimension. So specifically, social theorists that are engaged in ameliorative projects, I've argued, themselves tend to construe these projects in descriptive metaphysical terms. Now, of course, this isn't an indefeasible consideration because they might just be misconstruing their own project, but I think that it's at least a strong defeasible consideration in support of premise 2. Okay, and finally, premise 3. So according to what I think is the prevailing realist conception of metaphysics within contemporary analytic metaphysics, the discipline of metaphysics is concerned to describe the true nature or structure of reality. And this realist conception of the task of metaphysics dovetails with a realist methodology. So specifically, epistemic values are what's sometimes called constitutive values. So for example, coherence, simplicity, unity, fruitfulness, explanatory power. These are the sorts of values that can be relevant to theory choice. But contextual or non-epistemic values, as they're sometimes called, are not relevant to theory choice. And normative and political considerations are paradigmatic examples of these sort of contextual or non-epistemic values. Now, I should note here that one could, of course, deny this prevailing realist conception of metaphysics. So Amy Thomason has a whole really interesting body of work arguing for deflationism in metaphysics. And so that is one route out of this puzzle. So that's something that I'll set aside for the purposes of this talk. So I will be pretty much assuming this realist conception of metaphysics here. Okay, so that then is the puzzle. So now what I want to do is to consider 2 possible resolutions of this puzzle that I think can be drawn out of the existing literature and then give some arguments against both of them. So the first resolution is Elizabeth Barnes's realist resolution, which denies the third premise. And so here's Barnes's argument as I understand it. So Barnes starts with the idea that expressive and explanatory adequacy are relevant to theory choice in metaphysics. So that a given theory is able to express and explain that which needs to be expressed and explained are just uncontroversial epistemic or constitutive values. But then she argues normative and political considerations are actually relevant to evaluating a given metaphysical theory's expressive and explanatory adequacy in certain special cases. So which cases are these? Well, cases where the explanandum, so that which we're trying to explain, already involves normative and political considerations. So for example, if we're trying to give a metaphysical theory of gender, then the explanandum will include facts pertaining to gender injustice. So for instance, that there's a gender pay gap, that women on average do more caretaking and housework than men, that women leaders are subject to the double bind, and so on. But this explanandum then is already normatively thick. And so in order to think about whether a given theory of gender then adequately expresses and explains all these things, normative and political considerations are obviously going to be relevant. We have to consider normative and political facts. Okay, and so then it follows for Barnes that normative and political considerations are relevant to theory choice in metaphysics in these special cases when the explanandum already involves normative and political considerations. Okay, so the problem I think with this resolution is that according to Barnes, normative and political considerations are only relevant to theory choice in metaphysics by way of being relevant to the evaluation of expressive and explanatory adequacy. Now, I think that might be fine, actually, as an interpretation of Hasslinger, which is Barnes's aim. But I think that if we're trying to kind of understand ameliorative projects more broadly, including the projects of Dembroff and Mann, then this won't work. And that's because Dembroff, Mann, and at least some other ameliorative theorists take normative and political considerations to be relevant to theory choice, even when these considerations are not relevant to the evaluation of expressive and explanatory adequacy. So these theorists want to countenance a much wider role for these sorts of considerations. So for example, Dembroff argues that a theory of sexual orientation should be conducive to establishing legal and social protections for persons with queer sexual orientations. So that's a legal political consideration that I think gets to be relevant, but not by way of being relevant to expressive and explanatory adequacy. So similarly, Kate Mann argues that a theory of misogyny should not be silencing for its victims and should make misogyny, as she says, epistemically accessible to its victims so that the victims can come to have justified true beliefs and knowledge about the misogyny they've encountered. And so again, I take it that this is a normative political consideration that gets to be relevant, but not by way of being relevant to expressive and explanatory adequacy. Okay, and so the upshot then of this discussion of Barnes is that her resolution only vindicates a fairly weak reading of premise one of the puzzle. So on this weak reading, normative and political considerations are relevant to theory choice in an ameliorative project, but only by way of being relevant to the valuation of these uncontroversial epistemic values, expressive and explanatory adequacy. However, some ameliorative theorists, including Dembroff and Mann, I think are committed to a stronger reading of premise one, on which normative and political considerations are themselves directly relevant to theory choice in an ameliorative project. And so Barnes's resolution then, even if it works for Hasslinger, it won't work for ameliorative projects more generally. Okay, so now let me move on to another resolution that I think can be drawn out of the literature, which I'm calling Francesco Guala's anti-realist resolution. And this resolution denies premise two. Now, I should note that Guala himself does not argue for this sort of resolution, but he does offer an interpretation of ameliorative projects that I think can be used to make this argument. And so here's the argument as I construct it. So the first idea is that the target phenomenon of an ameliorative project is such that its very nature or essence depends on our subjective beliefs, normative desiderata, or the like. And so this, I take it, is the core anti-realist ontological tenet, and this is the interpretation of ameliorative projects that Gawala suggests. Okay, but then the argument goes, if the very nature or essence of an item depends on our subjective beliefs, normative desiderata, or the like, then that item doesn't have a real true nature. And the idea here is just that real true natures must be suitably independent of us. And so then it follows that ameliorative projects are not descriptive metaphysical projects which aim to elucidate the real true nature of their target phenomena. Okay, so the problem, I think, with this anti-realist resolution is that there's a crucial ambiguity in this idea that the essence of some item X depends on our subjective beliefs, normative desiderata, or the like. So on one way of understanding this idea, the idea is that the essence of X involves and therefore ontologically depends upon our subjective beliefs, normative desiderata, or so on. So I think understood in this way, it's plausible to attribute this thesis to at least some ameliorative theorists. So for example, on Haslinger's account, the essence of being a woman will involve certain subjective beliefs, namely beliefs and attitudes towards other people and what sex they are. Still, or yet, I think there's no good reason to suppose that real true natures can't involve us and our attitudes in this way. And that's because I subscribe to a neo-Aristotelian concept of essence, on which a statement of an item's essence is just trying to give an answer to the question, what is X? Or the distinctively metaphysical reading of that question, what is X? And so on this conception of essence, there really are no constraints on what can figure in that statement of essence. And in particular, there's nothing to rule out subjective beliefs, normative desiderata, or anything like that from figuring in the essence of an item. Okay, so I think on that way of understanding the idea, the argument doesn't go through. So I think an alternative way of understanding this idea that the essence of X depends on our subjective beliefs, normative desiderata, or the like, is that these beliefs or desiderata are ground the fact that the essence of X is what it is. Or in other words, they ground the fact that the essence of this item X is, say, this as opposed to that. So this is a strongly constructivist view of essence. And I think if we go this route, then there's more plausibility to the idea that real true natures can't depend on us and our attitudes in this way. But I think that here, there's really no good reason to attribute this sort of extreme constructivist view of essence to ameliorative theorists. So I think if these theorists did endorse something like this constructivist view, there should be at least some discussion in the literature of how the essences of these items get constructed by us in this way. But I don't think that there is such a discussion in the literature, with perhaps the one exception of Austa's earlier work on essentiality conferred. But even in the case of Austa, that earlier work of hers isn't then employed in her more recent work on conferralism about social categories. And so I think there's really not a good textual basis for attributing this sort of extreme constructivist view of essence to ameliorative theorists. Okay, and so the upshot then of this discussion is that once this core anti-realist idea is disambiguated, the argument loses its force, either because it doesn't go through or because there's not a good basis for attributing the relevant view to these theorists themselves. Okay, so in the remainder of the talk then, I want to propose my own positive resolution of the puzzle, which I call a pluralist neo-Aristotelian resolution. So the basic idea is that ameliorative projects can be broken down into several distinct stages, and there's no single stage which involves both descriptive metaphysical inquiry and a direct appeal to normative and political considerations. And so the influence of these normative and political considerations can be cordoned off, as it were, from the genuinely metaphysical part of the project. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So this resolution relies on an important background ontological commitment, and this is central to the resolution. And this commitment is to pluralism about the relevant kinds. So an ameliorative approach to X on this view says that there's a plurality of kinds in the vicinity of X. And this location, I should say, is due to Dan Lopez de Sá, where a kind is in the vicinity of X if it exists and its members include all paradigm instances of X and exclude all paradigm non-instances of X. And as I understand paradigm instances, a paradigm instance of X is just an instance that all or nearly all competent language speakers agree is an instance of X, and similarly for paradigm non-instances. So to give an example, an ameliorative approach to gender then is committed to the view that there's a plurality of kinds in the vicinity of gender. So these might include gender as sex, gender as class, gender as identity, and perhaps others. So each of these kinds then will include all paradigm instances of gender. So for instance, woman and man, and they'll include, exclude all paradigm non-instances of gender. For instance, Black and white. So these are races, not genders. And these kinds may differ over non-paradigm instances. So for instance, genderqueer might be a non-paradigm instance that some of the kinds will include as a member and some will exclude. Okay, so that's the ontological commitment that's in the background. So against the background of this pluralism, I think that we can understand ameliorative projects as involving 4 distinct stages. So stage 1 is to just identify all the kinds in the vicinity of X. So this stage will involve descriptive metaphysics because it involves a claim about which kinds exist in the world. And that's because for a kind to be in the vicinity of X, remember that it has to exist. And so this stage will involve some ontology. But I want to suggest that this stage does not involve direct appeal to normative or political considerations, which are independent of epistemic values. Okay, so then moving on to stage 2, here we consider all the kinds from stage 1, and then we decide which of these kinds to focus on or spotlight, as it were. So kind of to put this metaphorically, we can imagine that we, the theorists, have this flashlight, and we have to decide where to shine that light, and therefore which kinds to kind of put in the spotlight. And so we can shine a light at one kind, several kinds, but not all of them, because we have a limited amount of attention. So this stage, I want to suggest, involves direct appeal to normative and political considerations, because these are precisely the sort of considerations that are going to be relevant to deciding which kinds to spotlight. And I should say that which kinds to spotlight might even depend on kind of the context that you're in. So you might think that for certain purposes or in certain contexts, we should spotlight certain kinds, and for other purposes or in other contexts, we should spotlight other kinds. However, at this stage, I think there isn't going to be any descriptive metaphysical inquiry, and that's because choosing what to focus your attention on, so deciding on the subject matter of your inquiry, is not going to be part of the kind of metaphysical inquiry itself. Okay, so then stage 3 will be to specify the essence of the kinds spotlighted in stage 2. And so this is where the neo-Aristotelian conception of essence becomes relevant. So according to this conception, the neo-Aristotelian conception of metaphysics more broadly, and then of essence as well. So according to the neo-Aristotelian conception of metaphysics, at least one central task of metaphysics is to investigate the essences of entities in the world. So this is an idea that we find, I think, going back to Aristotle himself, but in the more contemporary literature, in the work of Kit Fine, Catherine Kozlicki, E.J. Lowe, and others. And so then that's the neo-Aristotelian conception of the task of metaphysics. Then according to the neo-Aristotelian conception of essence, which I've already mentioned, a specification of X's essence provides an answer to the distinctively metaphysical question, what is X? And it also provides what's called a real definition of X. So this stage then will involve descriptive metaphysics because it involves a claim about essence, and claims about essence are in the purview of metaphysical inquiry. But I want to suggest this stage does not involve direct appeal to normative or political considerations, which are independent of epistemic values. So I want to allow that at this stage, the sort of normative political considerations that Barnes focuses on can be involved. So these are considerations that are relevant by way of being relevant to uncontroversial epistemic values. But I think there won't be this direct appeal to normative or political considerations, which aren't relevant by way of being relevant to epistemic values. Okay, and finally then, at stage 4, we formulate a concept of each of the spotlighted kinds such that the nominal definition of the concept matches the real definition of the kind as it was specified in stage 3. And then we also decide which term in our language to pair with each concept. So just to illustrate this, if you're, say, Catherine Jenkins, giving an ameliorative count of gender, then stage 4 will involve formulating a concept of both gender as class and gender as identity, and then giving a nominal definition of those concepts that matches the real definition of the kinds that was specified. And then further, deciding whether to pair the term woman with the one concept or the other, and then deciding which term to pair with the other concept. Okay, so this stage then, I think, will involve direct appeal to normative or political considerations because these considerations will be relevant to deciding which term to pair with each concept. And so, for example, in Jenkins's case, she appeals to these sort of considerations to argue that we should pair the term gender with gender as identity as opposed to gender as class. But I want to suggest that this 4th stage doesn't involve descriptive metaphysical inquiry. And so, again, it's not a stage at which we have both metaphysical inquiry and the involvement or direct involvement of these normative or political considerations. Okay, and then so just to conclude then, the resolution that I've proposed effectively says that while only certain stages of the ameliorative project involve descriptive metaphysics, namely stages 1 and 3, and only certain other stages involve this direct appeal to normative or political considerations, which are independent of epistemic values, namely stages 2 and 4. And so premise 1 of the puzzle on its stronger reading is only true for certain stages, namely 2 and 4, while premise 2 is only true for other stages, namely 1 and 3. And so we don't have any single stage for which both premises are true. And so our puzzle is dissolved. Okay, I think I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asya. It was very great talk, and I really like your very elegant solution to the puzzle. So I leave if I don't know if someone wants to ask a question, maybe. Okay, Asa, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I just had a question out of curiosity. I read Charlotte Witt's The Metaphysics of Gender some time ago, and she also works within an Aristotelian framework, trying to do a similar thing, but proposes a little bit of a different solution than you, with sort of employing this idea of social individuals in addition to persons, so to speak. So I was just wondering, have you also considered her solution here?
Yeah, thanks, Elsa. So I don't see Charlotte Witt as trying to offer a resolution to this puzzle about ameliorative metaphysics, at least as I read her work. So I think that she's kind of pretty clearly doing just descriptive metaphysics. And I think she would describe her work that way. So given the project that she's doing, she does have this specific essentialist view, which she calls uni-essentialism, which says that gender is uni-essential to the social individual. And she takes that to basically mean that gender is kind of this unifying social role that unifies us into a social individual. And she then distinguishes that from a thesis about the essence of social kinds. So social kind essentialism, she says that social kinds have essences, and so that's a different essentialist thesis. And so she actually doesn't kind of argue for social kind essentialism, at least in her book, The Metaphysics of Gender, and instead argues for uni-essentialism. So I'm not sure that really interacts so much with what I've done in this talk. So in other work, I have argued for social kind essentialism. And so I guess I would be on kind of the other side of theorists then who are arguing for that thesis, which is distinct from Charlotte Witt's thesis. Now, I also have a lot of sympathy actually for Charlotte Witt's thesis. And I think that actually some of my work on social objects might lead into that direction, but that's something I would have to explore more.
Great.
Yeah, so did that
you.
answer the question?
That did, yes, thank you.
Thomas, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. This is clarificatory, I think. It's about sort of the four-stage process and how to understand it precisely. So in stage one, when I'm identifying all the kinds in the vicinity of X, so I guess one way to formulate the question is sort of how rich or sparse I should be thinking this space of kinds will be. So I'm thinking, well, this is interpretation, but that presumably I'm picking out these kinds even at stage one under some kind of description, because it seems that if I want to work out which ones to spotlight, you know, to have reasons to spotlight one over another, I must be presumably thinking of them as a certain kind or something like that, and not mere extensions or something like that. But then, and then, well, of course, that doesn't mean that I know what the essence is. So then at stage three, I can work out what that is for the spotlighted ones. But then at stage four, you say that I formulate a concept of each spotlighted kind such that blah, blah. And there it seems that I must somehow be coming at this task as, I don't know, not having yet conceptualized these kinds, or and so that I had a bit of trouble understanding how that worked, because my initial take on it was, okay, I have concepts of these kinds, and on the basis of these concepts, I decide which one to spotlight, and then I work out what the actual essence of them is. But that seems like it can't be quite what you mean. So maybe you could clarify a bit what you mean.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. That's a really great question. So I think there are really two parts to your question. So the first part concerned how rich or sparse the plurality has to be, and the second question concerned the relation between, well, stage four and stage one. So maybe let me address the second question first. So I think that's a really good point that you made. So I agree that we're picking out the kinds under a description in stage two when we're deciding which to spotlight. So I was thinking the description would be something like gender as sex, gender as class, gender as identity, right? And so then when I come to stage four and I say we're formulating a concept, I think that's a bad locution. I think I should change that and say something like engineer or revise the concept. Right. So I had in mind like conceptual engineering. In a previous version of this talk, people were a bit unhappy. I don't remember why with like engineering, maybe because they thought, I don't know, engineering has some connotations that also didn't fit. But maybe what I should say is revise, right? And so, as you said, the essence is presumably going to be different from the initial kind of nominal definition by way of which we just pick out the kind. And so there will be a revision involved. Right. So that's a good point, and I think that's what I should say. Now, as to the question of how rich or sparse this plurality has to be, so I was hoping to, at least for the purposes of this resolution, remain neutral on that. So I'm thinking that my resolution is compatible with there being like a massive plenitude, and it's compatible with there being, not so many of these kinds, right? So maybe there's just 3, like the ones I mentioned. Now, a further methodological question is, well, how do we like decide between well, massive plenitude on the one hand and something more restricted? And if we go for something more restricted or limited, then like, how do we figure out which kinds are there? So I think that's going to ultimately depend on your view of kinds. And I was hoping that my proposal would be compatible with at least like a broad range of views. I didn't want to take a specific view. But I guess one view that I'm kind of sympathetic to, probably one of my favorite views, is a view on which, well, kinds have to be explanatory. And so ultimately, like the kinds in the plurality, they're going to be kinds that play some role in explanation and prediction. So I think something like Muhammad Ali's conception, I take it. Now, that might be a little bit problematic because we might want to include in the plurality some kinds that haven't yet gotten to be explanatory because we want to say they've just been introduced or something. So I think there are worries with that way of going, and I think I need to think more about that. But yeah, I think I'd probably want to myself go in a less plenitudinous direction, and the way that I would want to restrict it probably would have something to do with explanation and prediction. But again, I at least hope that the resolution is compatible with different ways of going on that question.
Right. Well, thanks. That's super helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Muhammad Ali, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting, and it's I think connects with a lots of other debates. I mean, I think that this puzzle that you've identified really transcends the essentialist approach and really applies to any project that thinks that descriptive metaphysics should be done, relatively independently of normative and political considerations, but that also allows that there's a kind of an ameliorative project within metaphysics that can be responsive to those kinds of considerations. And I'm very sympathetic. I mean, I think this really agrees with the ways that I conceive of these, the way that these projects relate to each other. But it also relates to a debate even in the sciences where, people talk about, whether scientific research can be conducted independently of political and normative considerations. And I think proponents of the so-called value-free ideal, I think it's a bit of a misnomer, have tried to articulate a kind of staged account of, say, for instance, political values, social values might be involved in deciding which research questions to pursue, but they shouldn't be involved in trying to evaluate which evidence is stronger, or in formulating hypotheses, or in testing them, and so on. But then they might be involved again in trying to decide which theories to apply in the form of technologies and so on. Now, the standard response to that kind of approach, especially by feminist philosophers of science, people like Helen Longino and Elizabeth Anderson, is to say, if I understand it correctly, that kind of staged approach is a bit artificial. And it's not as though, when one is deciding which research questions to pursue, one doesn't have, at least an eye on what hypotheses are more likely to be true in a particular domain or something like that. And so I was just wondering whether that same kind of critique can be raised here, that there's a real sort of artificial parceling of the stages of inquiry, and that we can't really keep them as clearly separate. I don't know what you would think about that kind of a response.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so I think there were two really great points you made. So the first was about how the puzzle arises, kind of not just for an essentialist approach. I completely agree with that. So my kind of route into this was through my work on social kind essentialism, but I think you're exactly right that really anyone who wants to say that there's a descriptive metaphysical element to these projects, whether or not they think that that metaphysical element involves specifying the essence of these things, I think will be subject to this sort of puzzle. So I think someone who wants to say, well, we're investigating the grounds of these kinds, or the real definitions construed in some other way, or I don't know, even just like nature, but not committing to essence or anything like that. So I think all those people are going to be subject to this same sort of puzzle. Now, the second point you made was that, look, hasn't there been this similar puzzle raised in the science case? Yes, I also agree with that. And actually, if you have some references for me, so I know the Anderson and Wangino work, but if there's others that you think that are very relevant, I'd be super happy to hear that, because I'm not as familiar with the science stuff as you are, I think. But on the substantive point, though, so you said that a critique that they've made to the stage sort of approach is that it's artificial. And so doesn't that also apply to my proposal? So I think there's different things that we might mean by artificial. So I mean, one thing you might mean is just that it's idealized and that like in practice, it never actually happens in these like very distinct stages and in this particular order. So if that's what's meant, then I guess I agree that it's artificial. So for example, I don't think that ameliorative projects always go exactly like stage one, and then you complete stage one, and then stage two, complete stage 2, 3, and 4, and so on. So rather, I think that you might kind of be starting with 1, but you might not be so sure, and then you might move on to 2, and then 3, and then once you try to specify the essence, then you see that, actually, there might be like 2 accounts that you think kind of both have a lot of merit, and then you might actually end up kind of going back and thinking, well, maybe ultimately that's because there are more kinds in this plurality than I had initially thought. So I think that there could be this movement between stages, and that kind of what you come to at a later stage might then impact kind of your answer to an earlier stage. And so I think, yeah, in practice, it's definitely not going to be this like very clean cut, like do stage 1, do stage 2, and just go through it like that in order. Now, I guess I don't really see that as an objection, though, because I think that what I'm trying to argue is that there's at least in kind of idealized way of viewing what's going on, where we can cordon off the influences of these normative political considerations. And if in practice, it's a bit messier, I don't really see that that's ultimately a problem. Now, it might mean that kind of normative and political considerations, in fact, are gonna enter in a problematic way, because of like our limitations as researchers. But I still don't see that as kind of, I don't know, super problematic. If in principle we could, if we like did it a bit better. So I think the messiness is just going to be there, but kind of not allowing the normative political considerations to enter in at the kind of relevant points, I think that is something that in principle we kind of could do, even with like all the messiness of the kind of real world application of this.
Ryan, you had a question?
Could I just sorry, that's okay. No, I just saw there's quite a few questions, but can I just follow up really quickly? I guess the concern was not so much the messiness or the fact that this is a bit of a rational reconstruction, but I guess to take it back to Thomas's question about sparseness. So, in metaphysics, we might not have very strict standards for how to, say, individuate kinds. And if we find that for some political purpose, we want to, see more kinds in the sort of gender sex space than we might currently countenance, we might then loosen our standards in a certain way and say, well, look, we're being a bit too stringent about how to individuate kinds. I think there are more kinds there than it might seem at first glance, because we know that down the line that's going to serve our political or normative purposes. I guess that's the kind of concern I had.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern. I mean, I do think that I would have to kind of say that this model is committed to there being a fact of the matter as to what's in the ontology. So I don't think that I can allow on this model that there's equally good ways of carving up the world into kinds, some of which will give us more kinds, some of which will give us less. At least as far as I can see, I feel like that, yeah, that would be conceding that the ontological step at stage one of like figuring out which kinds there are in the world is going to involve these normative political considerations of like which carving of the world would be most useful. Yeah, so I think that wouldn't be compatible. I don't know that I have a substantive response as to why we should be realists about kinds as opposed to, you know, there are different ways to carve up the world. I think that's obviously a very, very big, important question in philosophy of science and metaphysics. But I do think this resolution is committed to the realist view on that.
Brian, you had a question.
Yeah, I think I'm talking enough. So let me move on to Augie and Laura.
Okay. Augie?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brian. And thanks, Asya, for a really interesting talk. Let me know if I'm cutting out. My Wi-Fi is not great. So I had, I think, a small point or question, maybe a clarificatory question about how you set up the puzzle. And in particular, Elizabeth Barnes's way, or the way you're construing her approach to the puzzle. As I understand it, I was actually maybe a little surprised that you think that she rejects 3 and instead of 1. And let me say why. So it seemed like you introduced a useful distinction between the explanandum being normatively thick and there being contextual values that are relevant for distinguishing or deciding between theories. And those seem to be like 2 different levels at which normativity enters. And if you, and it seemed like premise 1 and premise 3 both can kind of be disambiguated to mean either of those or a disjunction of the 2 levels. And if you construe them in terms of the thick explanandum, then it doesn't seem like premise 3 is well motivated. You motivated it, if I remember right, by appealing to contextual values. Because I mean, like meta-ethics might just be have a metaphysical considerations that normative considerations bear on insofar as we're trying to figure out how to give a proper metaphysics of normative kinds. But if you construe the puzzle in terms of the contextual values only, then it seems like maybe that is a way of generating the puzzle, but then she would reject premise 1, right? She would say that in that sense, premise 1, that normative and political considerations are relevant to theory choice. She would say, well, they're not relevant in the sense of contextual values guiding our theory choice. They're relevant in the sense just that the explanandum and is normatively thick. And so we should be sensitive to that. Is that, so I'm curious if I'm misunderstanding or if you'd be happy with that construal of what's going on or yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Augie. So, I mean, I do think that there are obviously different ways of disambiguating the premises. I mean, I think there's multiple ways in which they're ambiguous. And so I've gone for kind of one understanding of the premises as opposed to another. Why not construe Barnes as rejecting, so 1 as opposed to 3? So you're suggesting that, well, she's rejecting 1 because really 1 should be understood already as being only about contextual values as opposed to any sort of values. I mean, I guess I take it, I mean, as I read Barnes, I think the whole thrust of her kind of resolution seems to be that there is a role for these normative political considerations, but it's not a problematic one. And it's actually in line with kind of standard methodology in metaphysics. And so I think it would be, given that kind of a thrust of her work, I think it would be a little bit weird on an initial reading of the puzzle, at least, to say that she is denying that these considerations are relevant. Now, I mean, you suggested that she thinks they're relevant because they're in the explanandum and that somehow they're not at all relevant to theory choice. I'm not sure I read it quite that way. I was thinking that because the explanandum is already normatively thick, that there's a sense in which they are relevant to theory choice. Like when we're choosing between theories, we have to like consider normatively thick facts. So, I mean, that is obviously different from contextual values. But I guess I was thinking that that's still a sense in which these considerations are relevant to theory choice by way of being relevant to these other epistemic values. But I mean, I see your worry of kind of, yeah, taking these sort of considerations to really be the sort of thing that people have been very worried about. But yeah, I guess I read her as saying like, actually, this is kind of the only role that we needed all along. And when we're saying that these considerations are relevant, like this is the sense in which they're relevant. It's not the sense of like these contextual values, but in this other sort of sense of like when we're choosing between theories, well, we have to consider the data. And if the data involves this kind of stuff, then we have to consider these normatively thick things. I don't know if that's at all helpful.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
So let's take a 5-minute break, and thank you again, Asya, for this very great talk and Q&A.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your questions.
And see you in 5 minutes at 1.